It's Thursday, January 21st. Welcome to another episode of Legal Briefs. I'm Wes Austin. I'm a lawyer keeping you updated on the latest legal news. The question we're going to be talking about today, is it constitutional for the Senate to have a trial for Donald Trump, even though he is no longer the president? So the House of Representatives voted 232 to 197 to impeach Donald Trump for the second time, impeaching Donald John Trump, President of the United States, for high crimes and misdemeanors. Now let's go down to Article 1, Incitement of Insurrection. So there's only one article of impeachment, and they are trying to charge him with incitement of insurrection for inciting the mob that stormed the Capitol on January 6th. So there are two issues. The first issue is, can you have a trial for impeachment in the Senate for someone who is no longer the President of the United States? All right, that's the threshold question, the first issue. The second issue is whether what Donald Trump did would qualify as a high crime and misdemeanor. Okay, now that second question, whether what he did would qualify as a high crime and misdemeanor, we're probably going to talk about that in another video. For this show today, we're just going to be talking about the threshold question. Is it constitutional for the Senate to hold a trial for someone who is no longer the President of the United States? So that first question, is it constitutional to hold a Senate trial for him? That has nothing to do with what Donald Trump did. This is a constitutional law question. So you're going to have to ignore whatever Donald Trump did while you are considering this question. Now, I want to note one thing. The question as to whether it is constitutional for the Senate to hold a trial for Donald Trump at this point, you have experts coming down on both sides of this. Anybody who tells you, oh, there's a clear answer and it's this, well, they're an idiot, because it's not a clear answer. Now, we should first start with looking at the language in the Constitution to see why this is a question to start with. So, this is what the Constitution says about impeachment. The President shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. So the Constitution clearly says the President. It doesn't say a former president. It doesn't say someone who used to be an officer. So we've got some language there that says clearly the President. So this specific question has not come up before. We've had 3 U.S. presidents who've been impeached, all of them while they were in office, okay? And none of them were convicted in the Senate. All were acquitted in the Senate. So this specific question for president has not come up. Now we should look at Article 1, Section 3 that describes the powers of the Senate. Okay, that's relevant as well. Judgment in cases of impeachment shall not extend further than to removal from office and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States. So on the one hand, you have people that are saying like, well, as long as you started the impeachment process while he's still the president, you can just keep going and finish it off. All right. Then you have other people saying, no, once he's not the president anymore, that means you can't use this process anymore. Okay. Those are basically like the very summary arguments for either side. So let's look at some prior examples from Congress. Now, these are not binding precedent. This is not like a court case where a follow-on court case needs to follow precedent set by another court. Congress doesn't work like that. We can look at these as examples that might be helpful to see what they did and why, but these are not binding. One example from history that shows a post-office trial, so someone who was no longer in office and was still tried by the Senate, is the example in 1876 of the Secretary of War, William Belknap. Okay, I think he was impeached for taking kickbacks. So a few minutes before the House impeached him, he resigned. But they continued and they impeached him, and then they held a trial in the Senate for him, and the trial went on, and then he was acquitted. Okay, so that was an example where a trial was held based on an impeachment in the Senate after someone had left office. But I do want to note that the majority of senators who acquitted him did so because they said they didn't think they had the authority to try someone who is no longer in office. Another example that I think is quite relevant is Richard Nixon. Okay, so Richard Nixon, he was a president had this huge Watergate scandal. They had a committee to reelect him. They broke into the Democratic headquarters in the Watergate Hotel. They were planting bugs. All sorts of dirty tricks started coming out, and so Congress started this investigation to see if they should impeach him. And I believe that the Judiciary Committee had decided, yes, we should impeach him. But before the House could take the full vote, Richard Nixon resigned. And once he resigned, the impeachment process was just dropped. Now, they could have continued to impeach him. They could have continued to impeach him and hold the trial for him in the Senate, but they didn't. Congress just stopped as soon as he resigned. And I think that's probably because Congress was thinking like, well, the impeachment process is to remove someone from office. He's resigned, so he's not in office anymore. What's the point? The whole policy behind impeachment is to remove them, so they dropped it. So one question, is this reviewable by a court? And the question I'm talking about is, if the Senate tries to hold a trial for Donald Trump right now, could the fact that they're holding a trial for him be reviewed by a court? In this situation, I think that one issue can be reviewable by a court because you're talking about what authority Congress and the Senate, what they really have over someone who's no longer an officer. So what will Donald Trump do when this is sent over to the Senate to start the trial? Donald Trump, he could send his lawyers in and start to defend himself. Okay, he could start to defend himself against this impeachment article. Alternatively, he could just say, I don't think you guys have jurisdiction over me, and he could file a lawsuit in district court seeking some kind of declaratory judgment that the Senate doesn't have jurisdiction and authority over me. I think that could end up getting appealed and getting up to the Supreme Court, and we could hear what the Supreme Court thinks on that issue. I do think that is a constitutional law question that the Supreme Court would want to address, because I think that is an open question. Okay, so what do I think? Just remember, experts are coming down on both sides. Okay, and so I don't think there's a clear answer on this. This is just what I think. But I think based on the plain reading of the Constitution, I don't think it would be constitutional for the Senate to hold this impeachment trial for Donald Trump because he is no longer in office. And my reading of the Constitution is just, well, the Constitution said that you guys can conduct this process for someone who's an officer. But when they're not an officer in the federal government anymore, your jurisdiction, your authority ends to try them. That is why we have the court system. So to me, the plain reading of the Constitution is impeachment is to remove someone. That is why you have impeachment, is so that you can remove them from office. And that later clause is trying to warn against overreach by the legislative branch. That's exactly what they're doing when they're saying and judgment in cases of impeachment cannot extend further than removal and disqualification. But there's an and there, removal and disqualification. If that would have been an or there, I think that might be different. If it said judgment in cases of impeachment shall not extend further than to removal from office or disqualification to hold future office, I think it might be different, but there's an and there. So I think the Constitution is clearly contemplating that impeachment is for removal. That's what it's for. Oh, and if you do that, you can also disqualify from holding future office. I just don't think it's a proper reading to read it otherwise. Now keep in mind, we're not talking at all about what Donald Trump did. This threshold question of whether it's constitutional has nothing to do with what he did or didn't do. Okay, that really comes up in that second question that we aren't talking about today. Today we're just talking about that threshold question of whether it's constitutional. Any liability that may have occurred is still going to be there. So you're still going to have, if there is criminal liability, it will still be there. If there's civil liability, it will still be there. This impeachment process is this separate process that's really this political procedure for removing someone from office. And I feel like people are thinking like, well, if we don't have this trial, he's going to get away with it. If there's any kind of criminal liability or civil liability, nothing has happened to that. That is still there, and it's still on the table for people. This impeachment process, though, I think the Constitution clearly says it's for removing someone from office. And if you do that, you can also disqualify from holding future office, okay? I think we need to at least mention what a bill of attainder is, okay? The U.S. Constitution specifically states that the United States government cannot have a bill of attainder. Let's read this from the Constitution. No bill of attainder or ex post facto law shall be passed. So a bill of attainder is a legislative act that names a specific person and doles out some kind of punishment on them without any judicial review, without going through due process. I think this kind of smells a little bit like a bill of attainder because it was not done while Donald Trump was still in office. Stay tuned. We'll talk to you next week.